Great. Thank you so much, Biz. As many of you know, my name is Justine Davis. If you're joining us for the first time, I will introduce myself briefly. I am an LSA Collegiate postdoctoral fellow at the University of Michigan in the Department of Afroamerican African Studies. And I'm really excited to be the moderator for this working group, which is entitled Practical Implications for Peace Building. So yesterday we had a really great working group with the Rebecca Littman and Rebecca Wolf, looking at methodology and thinking through ethics. And I think we had a really great discussion. I think the format was really wonderful. So I'm looking forward to an equally productive and exciting discussion today with our two working group leaders. So Aila Matanock, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of California, Berkeley, one of my mentors, and Tim Phillips, who is the founder and CEO of Beyond Conflict, which we have heard a lot about Beyond Conflict and the work that they're doing across the world throughout this conference. So I'm excited to hear about both of your work and how you will let us know about practical implications for peace building. So what I will do first is turn it over to Aila to discuss, kind of give some thoughts on this topic, and then I'll pass it on to Tim. So take it away, Aila.
Great, thank you so much for having me, Justine and Biz and Cecilia, and for organizing this fantastic conference. I am very much a political scientist who works on post-conflict stabilization, and in particular through post-conflict elections. I work in a lot of different countries: Colombia, Cote d'Ivoire, Myanmar, Philippines, Solomon Islands. But as a political scientist not studying trauma directly, although having sat on both Justine and Biz's committees, I've learned a lot about it. This conference has sort of taught me a lot of new concepts and new ways to think about things. So I want to push some of these insights, as several other speakers have begun to do as well, to scope out from the personal to the political. In particular, thinking about what the policy or practical implications of this work are for peace building in the way that I would normally conceptualize this, which is these programs that seek to stabilize countries that have been affected by conflict. So in particular, I want to consider these post-conflict contexts and ask a central question, which is, what problems do peace building programs actually solve? I'm going to argue that we actually don't know a lot about this, but that the work that we've seen on trauma and related concepts may hold the key and a lot of theory for how we might go forward on this. But that many of these dimensions need to be brought together with the politics in order for us to understand these cycles of violence. So stabilizing and consolidating peace in post-conflict contexts is a central aim of much of the work of the international community, right, from a policy perspective now. So not only is the UN currently leading 12 active peacekeeping operations, but other organizations are also operating dozens of missions with similar aspects in post-conflict contexts. Aid spending is disproportionately flowing to post-conflict contexts. The UK, for example, sets aside about 1.3 billion a year for their conflict stability and security fund. And so it's no surprise that these contexts see much higher rates of aid in the first 6 years after conflicts terminate as compared to other very similar countries. Many of the resources flow to specific programs that policymakers tout as helping to stabilize and consolidate peace broadly in these contexts. Our current understanding, I think, of how policy programming helps stabilize and consolidate peace really tends to fall into two different approaches. So the first approach, which is beloved by political scientists, I'm going to call a peace stabilization approach. It's largely top-down, and it mainly theorizes about and assesses how programs overcome credible commitment problems for governments and rebel leaders. Credible commitment problems, for those of you who aren't immersed in this political science literature, are where one side becomes temporarily stronger than an opponent, often during the implementation process, and then has an incentive to grab more power than it was provided in a settlement. These are special problems to specific post-conflict contexts, right? They're really about getting the rebels and the government to stop fighting and to have sustainable agreements. The programs under this umbrella include monitoring, verification, enforcement missions, but also power sharing agreements, security sector reform, demobilization efforts. The second approach, in contrast, I call the peace consolidation or peace building approach, is largely bottom up, and it primarily analyzes how programs reshape individuals, communities, and at the most aggregated, their relationships to the state. The changes sought through these programs, including building stronger state institutions by engaging the population, forming more resilient communities, and building social capital, as well as improving the well-being of individuals, would benefit any state. And so these are more common problems to any context, right? They're not specific to post-conflict context, although the dimensions of them may be specific in post-conflict contexts. These would include governance efforts, justice processes, media campaigns, and even like community-driven development and cash transfer programs. Most of the mental health interventions seem to fall under this peace building approach, so the second one. The peace building programs have become pretty ubiquitous in post-conflict contexts. They also are what we most study when thinking about these programs. The World Bank has spent like $85 billion on participatory development programs in the first decade of the century alone. There are many, many types of these like cash transfer programs and things like this. So similar programs exist outside of conflict context, sometimes with explicitly stated aims of de-radicalizing extremists or even preventing future political violence from occurring. But many frame these peace building programs as helping stabilize and consolidate peace. So the question I want to ask is, do they? What do we know about this? So these programs often nod to stabilizing peace. So for example, an assessment of a program about a local dispute resolution mechanism in Liberia framed this as being potentially important because, quote, these local incidents could spark a national crisis. But then they go on to assess sort of development related outcomes. And so we actually don't know whether they do spark national crises, right? Like whether they do lead back to conflict at the sort of state level or at these like civil war levels. The development and reverse aspects of civil wars, where they have certainly degraded economic functioning in these societies, can be very real. And so of course there are important development outcomes that we do want in these post-conflict contexts, but we also want to know whether or not they really contribute to peace. And most of the studies so far don't actually provide much of an answer on that. So a first step to solving this, I think, is considering and measuring outcomes related to conflict when evaluating these programs. So some steps, especially on mental health evaluations, would be to capture things like trauma, but also capture attitudes towards outgroups and behavior such as risk-taking. And we've seen some nice work starting to develop this out, both for average citizens and community leaders in, some of Betsy Pollack's work, for example, that she talked about in Biz's and Justine's work as well. This can begin to answer the question of how conflict exposure, but also experience might contribute to a recurring conflict process. But I think this is only the first step, because there are a series that inherently get us to thinking about how conflict actually occurs. So in many of these peace building programs, both policymakers and academics are increasingly interested in changing and assessing individual and perhaps local community attitudes and behaviors. These are micro studies in many cases. And they make sense in terms of outcomes about mental health or economic well-being. But as we move to civil conflict, that's inherently a group-based dynamic, right? You have rebel groups and you have governments and you have the way in which they interact. So how do these local or even individual community programs aggregate and influence the stability and consolidation of peace? So first step forward, next step forward, aside from measuring outcomes that might be related to like outgroups, is to tie many of these peace building programs and their evaluations to rigorous and standardized theories about how development and social outcomes tie to conflict processes broadly. So some of the work in these areas begins to develop theory of how employment relates to rebellion, for example, and assess these theories across cases. Spoiler alert, it actually points in the opposite direction from what many of the peace building programs assume. And there are some new reviews that are trying to develop this consolidated theory. But I would say that there's a promising, although not yet fully satisfactory, approach to tying individual and local community attitudes and behaviors to conflict recurrence that is emerging mainly from the psychological and sociological perspective. So here, there are theories that focus on factors like fear or trauma, collective identification with a violent group, the importance of leaders, constraining norms, hazes in which people fight, that do generate some standardized theories. So a standardized theory might be that cycles of violence persist, wherein fighters have committed to a violent group and otherwise broken norms, and so that makes them more likely to continue to fight over time. This draws on the work of Littman and Palak, so both speakers that we've seen in this conference. However, even the theories on these dimensions of socio-psychological barriers, they often stop short of articulating a pathway back to conflict where politics come into play in determining whether groups will use these potentially primed recruits to actually fight the state. So studies of group development could complement this work. Janet Lewis has a really nice book about how groups begin to form. In general, I think that there's a lot to do here that could be, thinking about peace building programs seek not to just change the individual and local community attitudes and behavior, but we can ask and we can develop theories about how they actually make conflict occurrence more or less likely, considering both these psychological and the political processes together, right? And how they come together. One final note, I see I've got about a minute, probably less than that now, since I just looked at the chat. But a final note on this is I think it's really interesting. One thing that's come up for me throughout this conference is to understand how peace building programs work in terms of preventing conflict processes from recurring across different types of conflict. So while many peace building programs target civil wars, similar efforts are being applied to like peacetime programs with the goal of heading off future violence, as well as to conflicts that have experienced like large-scale electoral or criminal violence, terrorism, or even genocide. But there really can be differences across these political processes, as well as potentially in the experience of individuals and communities going through them that can affect the programming needs. So there is this sort of like really interesting work coming out of genocide in Rwanda that Palak and others have noted where, getting more willingness to express dissent might be really important. Whereas in some other post-conflict contexts, getting more community cohesion may be sort of the essential aim, right? And those are really different factors that may be at work here. So I think accounting for some distinctions in these conflict types and incorporating them into the theories about how they might stabilize and consolidate peace are really crucial to what we might expect from these peace building programs. So I've taken you in a bit of a different direction here, thinking about what problems these peace building programs are aiming to solve and what they actually do solve. What I hope I've convinced you of is that we actually don't know a lot yet in terms of the work that we've seen on trauma and related concepts, how those actually relate to the political. I think they hold the key for starting important theories here, but I think we still have a lot of work to do on this. So I'll leave it there, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aila. And I think, your point about thinking about conflict processes is really relevant to a lot of what's been talked about across this conference, especially when people are thinking about like, when do we think people are actually finished with trauma, right? Or like when does trauma end, right? And how that might filter into some of these conflict processes. So thank you for your intervention. And I'm gonna turn it over to Tim.
Yes, well, thank you. And I will, first of all, I want to thank you, Justine and Biz, for this invitation, and follow with Aila, and then to see some of my friends and colleagues like Trisha and Wendy here, and Vivian. So I'm going to sort of ground my comments more in a sort of the practical side of my experience over, I'm dating myself, 30 years, almost 33 years of working on conflict and reconciliation around the world, and where trauma, or how people think about trauma, plays into processes of peace and reconciliation. And so, in thinking about this session and listening over the last day and a half to really, valuable contributions about trauma and peace building and some of the details of how we think of acute and chronic trauma, I mean, it's pretty clear that trauma exists anywhere where you see conflict. And it's also clear that dehumanization exists, or violations of dignity exist. But too often, people who are less steeped in, say, the research, they don't really understand what trauma means in a more sort of classical sense. They think everybody that's been through an experience is traumatized, or they can't really describe dehumanization other than what it feels to them. They don't recognize when they be violating somebody else's dignity, but they recognize when their dignity is violated. And so I think there's a real value in taking the research and what is the nature of dehumanization? What is the cognitive, if we have a sense, we certainly have done a dehumanization. We're certainly developing that in trauma. And I don't even know if it exists in dignity, right? But sort of the neural mechanisms and regions involved in that. And the reason I bring this up is when I think about past peace processes that I've been involved in, and more recent ones, I think in the context of Northern Ireland, as they were negotiating the Good Friday Agreement, it was very difficult to center trauma at the political level in the conversations. It was mostly centered in the community-based groups, victims groups that were victims of IRA violence, victims of loyalist paramilitary violence on the Protestant side, or people who are victims of state violence. And it was very difficult in the Good Friday negotiations over a long period of time to actually bring in a conversation of trauma. Because when it was attempted, normally by the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, in a sense as a more neutral participant in the negotiations, it then engendered, well, who's to blame for this? So it was less about what trauma means to communities, not only innocent civilians, but also others, participants in the violence, paramilitaries, people in the political movements. It was very difficult to bring this up in a way that wasn't about blaming people at the table or blaming their communities. So how to frame this in such a way that it becomes center into either a peace process or negotiations by the local actors is still something that needs to be navigated and really thought through. And then I know in the case of Bosnia, after the signing of the Dayton Peace Accords, we were approached by Richard Holbrooke and Cyrus Vance, the former Secretary of State, the prosecutor in New York, and who was involved in the Dayton Peace Accords. And one of the big issues is the problem of missing people in Bosnia from the three communities, Muslim, Croat, and Serb. And again, it was sidelined. Yes, we agreed more to satisfy these civilians and civil society groups and these missing persons organizations, but it wasn't really a centered conversation at the political table. And more recently, we were doing some work with the UN Special Envoy 2 or 3 years ago in Syria, Staffan de Mistura. And what I found was most compelling to him in understanding trauma, I mean, he was very interested in an authentic way as an envoy on the Syrian peace process, which was very, not robust to say the least, but really attempting to address these issues, that he found it difficult to get the experience and the legacy of trauma centered in the negotiations and even among his UN colleagues. And what he found really compelling is to say, in my 40-year career with the United Nations, I would see communities rally around glorious defeats of their ancient past, narratives of loss, narrative of dehumanization, narratives of trauma, many that people didn't directly experience and actually may have happened centuries before. But he found that that was really a galvanizing moment, even the narrative and the history and legacy of that, to bring people into violence. So one of the questions he had for me was, if we can understand how trauma or narratives of trauma could actually drive people into conflict, and not just the legacy of what trauma does to people, that might be a really helpful frame to make sure that when, whether in the UN, the EU, the United States, or other negotiators or people negotiating, that there's a more realpolitik basis for discussing trauma, not as an outgrowth of war, repression, and generations of such behavior, but as a key frame for understanding what is driving this conflict and how to prevent its repetition in the future. And so it's, I think, just sort of bringing that into that sort of discourse in a way that also, and I know there's research, some of the work that Biz and others have been looking at, has been looking at what role does trauma, how do you define trauma as it relates not only to conflict as a consequence, but maybe as a driver. And even if it's not directly felt by people, what happens, not only in terms of the possibility of, epigenetic inheritance, but what happens in terms of these narratives. In Northern Ireland, and I don't know the answer for this, But there are young people born after the Good Friday Agreement who are politically active and talked about loss and trauma of their parents and their generation. And there needs to be more research to understand what is driving that right now in Northern Ireland, and particularly marginalized communities in Northern Ireland who were born literally after the signing of the peace agreement. And, you know, I've often heard my colleague, Mike Nickenchuk, who I know spoke, I think yesterday and earlier, about in the work around trauma is how do we make meaning of that experience? And I think of it as individuals, but also as communities, and not just communities who have been traumatized, but are often in contact with communities across divides that either have been a cause of their trauma or indifferent to their trauma, or in the community where this trauma has taken place and maybe gets reinforced. How do they make meaning of that? Right? So it's the meaning making writ large in a community. And so just the language of it, the framing of it, not as a consequence of either, and we're thinking of it in the contours of conflict, repression, dictatorship, dehumanization, when you think of race in this country, but also what it means to understanding it as a driver, and a driver politically to conflict. And I think that would be a contribution. And I want to be cognizant of my time, and I know we're getting into further conversations, but you know, I know in the context of Northern Ireland, when there was a conversation after the Good Friday Agreement, should we have a South African style Truth and Reconciliation Commission? There was a lot of pushback from both communities, particularly Irish Republican. If you know it, there's Catholics, there's nationalists, Republicans much closer to Sinn Féin and the IRA, more, let's say, working class communities, who felt like, well, whose truth is being told and whose suffering is being recognized, and the legitimacy of the use of violence in their mind for centuries, not just generations, but centuries of dehumanization and trauma and exclusion. And so, you know, and too often these issues of how do we deal with the legacy of trauma gets put into a sort of a restorative justice, transitional justice category. And it's like, unfortunately, diversity, equity, inclusion often gets put into the human resources category in an organization, where it should be centered in the management and the leadership and the governance of an organization. So how can these issues not be just put in restorative justice and transitional justice, but actually be front and center into understanding the dynamics that shape conflict, and the dynamics that could actually help us address conflict so we don't see this repetition going forward. So I just want to stop with that, but I just wanted to throw out, you know, some of what I heard, but also somewhat of what I've observed in other settings. And thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. I think one thing that I was thinking about while you were describing these narratives of trauma and how they're used to potentially bring people to violence or kind of thwart peace building initiatives, it made me think about some of the calls that have been made by many panelists throughout this conference about really knowing the community that you study and drawing from that when we're thinking about interventions and understanding these narratives of trauma and thinking through how can we, how can we as researchers kind of incorporate or try to understand these narratives and how they may be impacting what we're doing. So I think that's a great call that you've put forward for researchers and practitioners when thinking about trauma. All right, so what I'm gonna do now is open, I have randomized everybody into breakout rooms, and I'm going to send here a Google Doc that we'll be using on the chat. I'm gonna send it on the chat. With some guiding questions. So ideally what you will do is have a scribe in your group that will keep track. There are 6 questions. You do not have to discuss all 6 questions, but they're just kind of motivation for you to kind of start conversations. And Aila and Tim will kind of hop around to the various rooms as conversations get started. And I will go ahead and open the rooms. We'll take about 15 minutes to discuss and then come back to